I'm Hannah Jackson, 28 years old, and 6 months ago my entire world shifted when Christie's auctioned my painting for $2.3 million. I thought that moment would be pure celebration, but what my family did next crushed me more than years of their criticism ever could. If you've ever had someone you love tear down your dreams just when you needed their support most, please let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe to join others who understand this particular kind of heartbreak. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my relationship with art means understanding how I met Gabriel, the one person who saw my potential when everyone else saw only mess and failure. It was October 2018, and I was working at a small coffee shop in Portland's Arts District, barely making rent, while trying to paint in the cramped studio apartment I shared with two roommates. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Perez next door watching her evening soap operas, and the smell of turpentine constantly mixed with whatever questionable leftovers my roommates left in the fridge. But in that chaos, I found focus with my brushes and canvas. Gabriel walked into the coffee shop on a particularly gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the rain felt more like mist and everything looked like a watercolor painting that hadn't quite dried. He ordered a simple black coffee, but what caught my attention was the way he lingered near the community art wall where local artists could hang their work. I had one small piece displayed there, an abstract landscape I'd painted during a particularly difficult period after my dad had called my latest series expensive finger painting that no adult should waste time on. Gabriel studied that painting for nearly 10 minutes, occasionally stepping back and tilting his head like he was trying to solve a puzzle. When he finally approached the counter, he didn't ask about the coffee specials or complain about the wait. Instead, he pointed to my painting and said, "The person who painted that understands something about loneliness that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid feeling." His voice was gentle but certain, like someone who'd spent years learning to see past surfaces. I remember my hands shaking as I wrote his name on the cup, partly from surprise and partly from the recognition that someone had actually seen what I was trying to express. That conversation stretched into an hour-long discussion about color theory and emotional expression, then into daily visits where Gabriel would bring different art books and we'd flip through them during my breaks. He worked as a gallery coordinator downtown, not wealthy by any means, but he had an eye for art that transcended price tags and market trends. Within 3 months, we were spending every evening together, either in my cramped studio space where he'd sit quietly while I painted, or walking through gallery openings where he'd introduce me to artists and collectors with genuine enthusiasm for my work. Gabriel never tried to fix my relationship with my family, but he did something more valuable. He showed me what support actually looked like. When I'd spend hours obsessing over a single brushstroke, he'd make dinner and leave it warming in the oven without saying a word about time management. When I'd cry after particularly harsh criticism from my father, Gabriel wouldn't offer advice or try to defend my dad's intentions. Instead, he'd ask specific questions about my artistic choices, helping me remember why I'd made them and what I was trying to communicate. By 2019, we'd moved into a proper one-bedroom apartment with north-facing windows and enough space for a real easel. Gabriel found a second-hand drafting table at an estate sale, and spent 2 weekends refinishing it until the wood gleamed honey gold in the afternoon light. We established routines that felt like building a life together: Saturday morning farmers market visits where we'd buy whatever vegetables looked most colorful, Sunday afternoon museum trips where we'd pick one piece to discuss for the entire week, and Wednesday evening wine and painting sessions where Gabriel would attempt watercolors while I worked on larger canvases. The work was flowing during this period in ways it never had before. I was exploring themes of connection and belonging, using layers of translucent color to create depth that seemed to shift depending on the viewer's position. Gabriel would often stand in different parts of our living room while I adjusted lighting, helping me understand how the paintings interacted with space and movement. We talked about emotion as geography, about how certain color combinations could make viewers feel like they were approaching something sacred or safe. My artistic confidence grew alongside our relationship. Gabriel encouraged me to apply for small grants and local exhibitions, helping me write artist statements that captured my intentions without sounding pretentious. When I got my first solo show at a community gallery in 2020, he spent the entire opening night watching other people's reactions to my work, occasionally catching my eye across the room with a smile that said, "See, they understand what you're doing too. The gallery show sold 3 pieces, enough to cover my materials for the next 6 months and begin thinking about art as more than just personal expression. Gabriel suggested I start documenting my process, taking photographs of works in progress and keeping detailed notes about color mixing and emotional intentions. We converted the hall closet into a storage system for completed pieces, carefully wrapping each canvas and maintaining a spreadsheet of dimensions, materials, and completion dates. By 2021, I had developed a recognizable style that galleries began seeking out. The paintings combined abstract landscape elements with subtle figurative suggestions, creating spaces that felt familiar yet impossible to place geographically. Gabriel called them emotional topography, and the description stuck. Local art critics started using terms like emerging talent and distinctive voice, language that felt surreal after years of family dismissal. But there were subtle warning signs I should have noticed, moments when Gabriel's enthusiasm seemed forced, or when he'd changed the subject too quickly when I mentioned wanting to share good news with my family. During one particularly successful gallery opening, I called my parents from the bathroom, excited to tell them about 3 sale inquiries I'd received that evening. The conversation lasted exactly 2 minutes before my mother politely redirected the discussion to my cousin's new accounting job, and my father made a comment about hobbies versus real careers. When I returned to the gallery, Gabriel was standing exactly where I'd left him, but something in his expression had shifted from celebration to protective concern. There was also the incident with the wedding invitation from my college roommate, where I'd mentioned wanting to bring Gabriel and maybe include some of my smaller pieces as a gift for the bride who'd always loved my work. My father's response was swift and definitive: family events weren't appropriate venues for peddling artwork, and I shouldn't assume people wanted my paintings just because they were polite about them. Gabriel witnessed that phone call from our kitbrez, and I watched him grip the counter with enough force to whiten his knuckles. The morning everything changed started with exceptional light. Pacific Northwest winters aren't known for spectacular sunrises, but that particular February morning in 2022, the low-hanging clouds created this golden filter that made our entire apartment feel like the inside of a cathedral. I was working on a large canvas, something that had been evolving for 3 months into what would later become the piece Christie's would auction. Gabriel made coffee and toast with the strawberry jam we'd bought at the farmer's market, and we ate breakfast mostly in comfortable silence, while I studied how the changing light affected the painting's emotional temperature. The call came at 11:43 a.m. I remember the exact time because I'd been mixing a particularly complex gray-green color, and had written the combination ratios in my sketchbook with a timestamp to recreate it later. My phone buzzed with my father's contact photo, unusual because he typically only called on scheduled occasions like birthdays or holidays. I answered expecting some routine family update, perhaps news about my younger brother's latest promotion or my mother's book club selection. Instead, his voice carried a familiar edge of controlled frustration that immediately transported me back to childhood moments when I'd tracked mud through the house or forgotten to complete some expected task. "Hannah, we need to discuss your little art situation," he began, using the tone typically reserved for addressing genuine problems that required adult intervention. "Your mother and I have been talking, and we think it's time you started taking your future seriously instead of playing around with paints all day." The conversation that followed lasted 18 minutes and systematically dismantled every artistic achievement I'd shared with them over the past 3 years. According to my father, the gallery sales were charity purchases from friends who felt sorry for me. The critical attention was local small-town nonsense that doesn't mean anything in the real world, and my relationship with Gabriel was enabling behavior that's preventing you from growing up and getting a real job like your brother. But what shattered me wasn't the familiar criticism. It was the revelation that they'd been actively discouraging other family members from supporting my work. When my aunt had inquired about commissioning a piece for her new home, my parents had told her I was going through a phase and suggested she wait until I'd moved on to something more practical. When my cousin had shared an article about my gallery show on social media, my mother had privately messaged her asking her to not encourage Hannah's unrealistic expectations about making money from art. The phone call ended with my father's definitive statement: "This whole painting thing is just expensive therapy, sweetheart. You're 26 years old and it's time to put away childish things and focus on building a real life. We love you too much to keep pretending this is going anywhere." The line went quiet for a moment before he added, "Gabriel seems like a nice young man, but he's not doing you any favors by encouraging this fantasy. Maybe it's time for both of you to reevaluate what you really want from life." I sat in our sunlit apartment for nearly an hour after ending the call, staring at the painting I'd been working on while my father's words echoed in my mind. Gabriel found me there when he returned from his morning run, still holding my phone and surrounded by the tools and materials that had defined my identity for the past 4 years. The contrast was surreal, this space that represented everything I loved about my life, suddenly infected by the poison of my family's complete rejection. When I finally spoke, the words came out in fragments interrupted by tears I hadn't expected. I told Gabriel about the conversation, about my family's secret campaign to undermine my work, about feeling like I'd been living in a bubble of false encouragement while everyone who supposedly loved me was waiting for me to snap back to reality. Gabriel listened without interrupting, occasionally reaching out to touch my hand but mostly just maintaining steady eye contact that reminded me I wasn't crazy or delusional. "They're afraid," he said finally when I'd exhausted myself explaining every painful detail. "People who've never taken creative risks can't understand why anyone would choose uncertainty over security. But that doesn't make them right about your work or your future." He gestured toward the paintings covering our walls, pieces that represented years of growth and experimentation and genuine artistic development. "This isn't therapy or hobby or phase. This is who you are, and anyone who loves you should be able to see that." 3 days later, my mother called to check in and see how I was processing our conversation. Her tone was gentler than my father's had been, but the underlying message remained unchanged. They were concerned about my stability and wanted to help me transition toward more conventional life choices. She suggested I consider returning to school for something practical like business administration, or perhaps explore opportunities in Gabriel's gallery world that didn't involve the uncertainty of being an artist. When I mentioned that I'd been invited to participate in a group exhibition at a prestigious gallery in Seattle, her response was tellingly lukewarm. "That's nice, dear, but you know these art world people probably invite lots of struggling artists to these things. I wouldn't read too much into it or get your hopes up about it leading to anything substantial." The conversation ended with her promising to support whatever decision I made about my future, but her tone suggested she'd already decided what that decision should be. The following week brought my brother David's engagement announcement, complete with elaborate plans for a celebration dinner where extended family would gather to toast the happy couple and discuss wedding arrangements. When I expressed excitement about attending and perhaps bringing a small engagement gift I'd painted for David and his fiancée, my mother's enthusiasm noticeably dampened. "Oh, sweetheart, that's so thoughtful, but you know how David feels about receiving artwork. Maybe something from their registry would be more appropriate." I hadn't known how David felt about receiving artwork, primarily because I'd never offered him any. But apparently my family had been discussing my artistic pursuits extensively in conversations that didn't include me, forming collective opinions about my work's value and appropriateness that they'd never shared directly. The realization that I was being discussed like a problem to be managed rather than a family member to be supported felt worse than outright criticism. Gabriel witnessed most of these conversations from our kippures or living room, occasionally catching my eye with expressions that ranged from supportive to increasingly concerned. After the engagement dinner discussion, he suggested we take a weekend trip to the coast to get some distance from family drama and focus on your upcoming exhibition. We drove to Cannon Beach and spent 2 days walking along tide pools and talking about art, relationships, and the difference between people who love you enough to let you grow versus people who love their version of you more than your actual self. During that trip, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to submit my work to larger galleries and competitions, regardless of my family's opinions about the viability of artistic careers. Gabriel supported this decision enthusiastically, helping me research submission requirements and deadline schedules. We spent the following month carefully photographing my strongest pieces and crafting application materials that presented my work professionally without compromising its emotional authenticity. The first major breakthrough came in April 2022, when I received acceptance notification for a juried exhibition at a gallery in San Francisco that typically showed established mid-career artists. My piece was selected from over 800 submissions, and the exhibition would run for 6 weeks with serious collector attendance and art press coverage. When I called to share this news with my parents, hoping this external validation might shift their perspective, my father's response was immediate and deflating. "Congratulations, but don't quit your day job just yet. These art competitions are usually just ways for galleries to make money off entry fees." That response marked a turning point in my relationship with my family's opinions. For the first time, I felt more angry than hurt by their dismissal. This wasn't about them protecting me from disappointment anymore. This was about them protecting themselves from having to acknowledge they'd been wrong about my potential. Gabriel recognized this shift immediately and encouraged me to trust my instincts about which opportunities to pursue, regardless of family approval or understanding. The San Francisco exhibition opened in June 2022, and 3 of my pieces sold on opening night to collectors who had no prior knowledge of my work or personal circumstances. The gallery director mentioned that several visitors had specifically asked about purchasing additional pieces, and she encouraged me to consider representation by their gallery for future exhibitions. When I shared this development with my family, my mother's response revealed the depth of their resistance to my success. "Well, I hope you're not counting on this continuing. You know how unpredictable art sales can be." By autumn 2022, I had gallery representation in 2 cities and a waiting list of commissioned pieces that extended into the following year. My work was being featured in regional art publications, and collectors were beginning to request specific pieces for their homes and offices. The financial stability that my parents had insisted was impossible through art was becoming reality, but their attitudes toward my career remained unchanged. If anything, their criticism intensified as external validation increased, as though my success threatened some fundamental belief system they weren't willing to examine. The piece that would eventually sell at Christie's was completed in December 2022, during a period when I felt simultaneously more confident in my artistic abilities and more isolated from my family than ever before. The painting emerged from months of exploring themes of belonging and recognition, using layers of color that shifted from shadow to light depending on viewing angle and environmental conditions. Gabriel often said it was like watching weather patterns move across an emotional landscape, and the description captured something essential about the piece's impact on viewers. When I photographed the completed painting for my records, something about the image suggested it belonged in a larger conversation about contemporary art than what my current gallery representation could provide. Gabriel agreed and suggested we research auction houses that specialized in emerging contemporary artists. The idea felt ambitious to the point of absurdity, but he convinced me that confidence in my work shouldn't be limited by my family's doubts or my own imposter syndrome. The process of submitting work to Christie's required extensive documentation and professional recommendations that took months to compile. By spring 2023, I had prepared a comprehensive submission package including the painting's history, exhibition record, and critical reception. The waiting period felt endless, filled with self-doubt and second-guessing that was amplified by my family's continued skepticism about my artistic pursuits. The acceptance call came on a Tuesday afternoon in August 2023, while I was preparing for a local gallery opening. Christie's contemporary art specialist explained that my piece had been selected for their November auction of emerging artists, with an estimated value of $800,000 to $1.2 million based on recent sales of comparable works. The conversation felt surreal, as though someone was describing another person's life rather than my own artistic trajectory. When I shared this news with my family, expecting that Christie's recognition might finally convince them of my work's legitimacy, their response revealed how deeply invested they'd become in my failure. My father's immediate reaction was concern about getting your hopes up and warnings about auction houses that manipulate prices to benefit their own interests. My mother suggested I not tell people about this until after it actually sells, because disappointment would be harder to handle if I'd built up expectations, but their most devastating response was yet to come. The auction was scheduled for November 15, 2023, and I invited my family to attend or at least watch the live stream, hoping this milestone might represent an opportunity for reconciliation and celebration. My father's response was swift and crushing. "Hannah, we've supported your art hobby for years, but we can't keep pretending this is a real career. Whether this painting sells or not, you need to start thinking seriously about your future and stop depending on Gabriel to enable these fantasies." The morning of the auction, I woke up in our apartment to the same exceptional light that had illuminated my work so many mornings before. Gabriel made coffee and toast with strawberry jam, maintaining our usual routine despite the extraordinary nature of the day. We dressed carefully, him in his best suit and me in a black dress that felt appropriately serious for what might be the most important day of my artistic career. Christie's sales room was intimidating in ways I hadn't anticipated, filled with people whose casual confidence suggested they attended art auctions regularly. Gabriel and I sat toward the back, close enough to see the auctioneer clearly, but far enough away to avoid feeling scrutinized by other attendees. When my painting appeared on the easel, looking smaller than I remembered, but somehow more significant in this context, my heart rate accelerated to the point where Gabriel reached over to steady my hand. The bidding opened at $600,000 and escalated rapidly through a series of paddle raises and phone bids that felt choreographed despite their spontaneity. Within 5 minutes, the price had exceeded the high estimate, climbing toward numbers that seemed disconnected from any reality I understood. When the hammer finally fell at $2, $3 million, the applause that followed sounded distant and dreamlike, as though I was experiencing someone else's triumph from a great distance. The immediate aftermath was a blur of congratulations from Christie's staff, paperwork signing, and contact information exchange with people whose names I struggled to remember. Gabriel maintained a protective presence beside me, fielding questions and scheduling follow-up conversations while I processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications from friends and colleagues who'd been following the auction online, their excitement and support creating a sharp contrast to my family's earlier dismissal. But the moment that crystallized everything came when I called my parents from the Christie's lobby, expecting that this undeniable validation might finally prompt acknowledgement of my artistic legitimacy. Instead, my father's first words were, "Well, I hope you realize this was just luck and won't go to your head. One sale doesn't make a career, and you'd be foolish to think this changes anything about the practical realities of trying to make money from art." My mother's addition was equally crushing. "Sweetheart, we're concerned that this might make you even more unrealistic about your future. You know how unpredictable the art world is, and we don't want you to make financial decisions based on one unusual sale. Maybe this is a good time to start transitioning towards something more stable while you're ahead." Standing in Christie's lobby, surrounded by evidence of my artistic success, and holding a phone that transmitted my family's complete inability to celebrate my achievement, I realized that no amount of external validation would change their fundamental rejection of who I was and what I valued. The sadness that followed this realization was different from the hurt I'd experienced during previous criticism. This was grief for relationships that I finally understood were never going to provide the support and recognition I'd spent years hoping to receive. Gabriel recognized the shift in my expression immediately and guided me toward a quieter corner where I could process the conversation without feeling observed by strangers. "You don't need their permission to be proud of yourself," he said quietly, his words cutting through the fog of family disappointment that threatened to overshadow the day's triumph. "This is your success, earned through years of work and talent that they've chosen not to see. Their inability to celebrate with you says everything about them and nothing about you or your work." The weeks following the auction brought a cascade of opportunities that validated everything Gabriel had said about my family's inability to recognize my potential. Gallery inquiries arrived daily from cities across the country, collectors commissioned new pieces at prices that exceeded my previous annual income, and art publications requested interviews about my background and artistic development. The practical career stability that my parents had insisted was impossible through art was materializing faster than I could have imagined. But alongside professional success came the painful process of accepting that my family's attitude toward my work reflected deeper issues that couldn't be resolved through external achievement. During a Thanksgiving phone call, my father suggested that the auction sale was probably money laundering or some other shady art world business, and warned me against assuming that future sales would be similarly lucrative. My mother added that she hoped I was being careful with the money and not making any major life changes based on one unusual event. Their response to my success forced me to recognize patterns of minimization and control that had characterized our relationship for decades. Every achievement was dismissed as luck or accident. Every recognition was explained away as politics or charity, and every step toward independence was framed as dangerous risk-taking that would inevitably lead to disappointment. The auction sale hadn't changed their perspective because their perspective wasn't based on evidence or outcomes. It was based on their need to maintain control and superiority in our relationship. Gabriel helped me understand that their behavior wasn't really about protecting me from disappointment. It was about protecting themselves from having to acknowledge that they'd been wrong about my potential, and that their advice had been not just unhelpful but actively harmful. Admitting that my artistic career was legitimate would require them to examine their own choices and possibly confront uncomfortable truths about their values and priorities. The decision to establish boundaries with my family felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I began limiting contact to scheduled calls where conversation topics were clearly defined in advance, avoiding spontaneous discussions about my work or future plans. When they attempted to offer unsolicited advice about career decisions or financial management, I politely redirected conversations toward neutral topics or ended calls entirely when redirection proved ineffective. This boundary-setting process revealed how much of our relationship had been built on their need to maintain advisory roles rather than mutual respect and support. When I stopped seeking their approval or sharing details about my professional life, our conversations became awkward and strained, highlighting how little genuine connection existed beneath their habitual criticism and control. The emotional work of accepting my family's limitations while protecting my own well-being was complicated by grief for the relationships I'd hoped we could have. I mourned the celebration dinners that would never happen, the proud parent conversations they'd never initiate, and the genuine excitement they'd never express about my artistic achievements. But I also experienced relief from no longer anticipating their approval or trying to translate my successes into language they might find acceptable. Gabriel's support during this period was invaluable, not because he tried to fix my family relationships or convince me that reconciliation was possible, but because he consistently reminded me that their inability to see my worth was their loss rather than my failure. He helped me understand that protecting myself from their negativity wasn't selfish or disloyal. It was necessary for maintaining the confidence and creativity that had led to my success in the first place. By spring 2024, I had established a new relationship dynamic with my family based on polite distance rather than emotional vulnerability. We maintained contact through holiday cards and brief birthday calls, but I no longer shared professional updates or sought their input on important decisions. This arrangement allowed us to preserve some semblance of family connection while protecting me from their persistent undermining of my confidence and achievements. The space created by these boundaries allowed me to focus more fully on artistic development and professional growth. Without the constant background noise of family disapproval, I was able to pursue opportunities that aligned with my creative vision, rather than trying to prove my legitimacy to people who'd already decided I was foolish and unrealistic. The work that emerged during this period was stronger and more confident, reflecting freedom from the need to justify my choices to unsupportive relatives. Looking back now, I understand that my family's response to my success taught me as much about unconditional love as their years of criticism had taught me about conditional acceptance. Real support doesn't require external validation to manifest. It exists whether you're struggling or succeeding, whether you're following conventional paths or creating your own. The people who truly care about your well-being celebrate your victories without needing to understand every aspect of your choices. If you're reading this and recognizing similar patterns in your own family relationships, I want you to know that protecting yourself from their negativity isn't betrayal or selfishness. You don't owe anyone access to your dreams or permission to diminish your achievements. The people who love you should be able to celebrate your successes even when they don't fully understand your path, and anyone who consistently undermines your confidence or dismisses your accomplishments is telling you more about their character than yours. The practical steps I took to establish boundaries might help if you're facing similar challenges. First, I stopped sharing details about my work or future plans with family members who had consistently responded with criticism or dismissal. This wasn't about secrets or punishment. It was about protecting vulnerable aspects of my life from people who'd proven they couldn't handle them supportively. Second, I learned to recognize the difference between genuine concern and disguised control. When someone consistently predicts failure or emphasizes risks without acknowledging your strengths or past successes, they're not protecting you, they're projecting their own fears and limitations onto your situation. Learning to identify this pattern helped me stop internalizing their anxiety as reasonable caution. Third, I surrounded myself with people who could celebrate my achievements without qualification or condition. Gabriel was essential in this process, but I also developed friendships with other artists and creative professionals who understood the challenges and uncertainties of non-conventional career paths. Having witnesses to your success who genuinely understand its significance can help counteract family members who minimize or dismiss your accomplishments. Finally, I practiced celebrating my own achievements, regardless of external validation or approval. This meant acknowledging milestones privately, treating myself to small celebrations, and documenting successes in ways that felt meaningful to me. Learning to value your own accomplishments independently of other people's reactions is crucial for maintaining confidence in the face of persistent criticism or indifference. The art world has continued to validate what I always knew about my work's value, with galleries in major cities now representing my pieces and collectors building relationships for future acquisitions. But more importantly, I've learned to trust my own assessment of what constitutes meaningful success, rather than depending on other people's approval or understanding to feel confident in my choices. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you for witnessing this experience, and for understanding that family relationships sometimes require difficult choices to preserve your own well-being and growth. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've faced similar challenges with unsupportive family members. Your stories matter, and sharing them helps all of us feel less alone in these complicated dynamics. Subscribe if you'd like to see more content about navigating family relationships while pursuing unconventional paths, and remember that choosing yourself isn't selfish when other people consistently choose to diminish rather than support your growth. You deserve relationships that celebrate your successes and encourage your dreams, even when those dreams look different from what others might choose for themselves. The people who truly love you will find ways to support your journey, even when they don't fully understand your destination.